Hey, thank you for joining me for another Slido Questions and Responses. This is a little bit different. I've never done a live video for answering these questions. I thought it would be a fun way how to both simplify my own process for creating these things and actually kind of honor the spirit of the question and responses, because the whole point is to make the sermon a more interactive back and forth between the preacher, and the people sitting there. And so if there are more questions, I will answer those questions also in this video as I take a stroll. So if I hope that you don't find this horrible, me walking. Anyways, whatever. So these questions are from a sermon I preached 2 weeks ago, August 13th, 2023. And that sermon was the last in our David series. It was focused on David and his death, and what does it mean for us to die well, and contrasting David and Jesus. And so I got some really interesting questions, and like I promised, I said I'll answer any question posed. And so always feel free on Sundays to go to Slido.com Redeemer to ask a question. So the first question was, how do I feel about reaching the ponytail stage? Feels great. I'm rocking it now. It keeps the hair out of my face and off my neck. Okay. Why does David lay his burdens of killing Joab and Shimei on Solomon? So in 1 Kings chapter 2, we see David in his final words to Solomon. He encourages him to do some good stuff, like, hey, obey God, listen to him. You should also be really kind to this other person because they were kind to me. But then he also tells Solomon, oh, remember Joab, my nephew, your cousin? Remember these bad things he did? Make sure he dies. Like, don't let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. And then he says the same thing about this other guy, Shimei, who kind of taunted David when David was at a low point in his life. So why does David do this? I think there are practical Game of Thrones considerations that make a lot of sense. I think that for Solomon, both Shimei and Joab probably don't have any love for Solomon, and it wouldn't be unsurprising if Joab, especially as a major political force at the time, if Joab decided, actually, I like this other guy, Abishai, to be king, not you, Solomon, so I'm going to support him being king and help overthrow you. So is there some political expediency wisdom in all this? I think yes. But as we think about this from the perspective of Jesus, who, as people taunt him, right, the politically expedient thing for Jesus to do is, to deny whatever, to get Pilate on his side, to say whatever the Jewish leaders want to hear so they don't kill him. But what he does is he intentionally goes to the cross, and then he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So I think David, this is an example of David being a coward, honestly, because David could have done either of these things in his own lifetime, and he chose not to do them. And because he chose not to do them, instead, he asks his son to essentially put blood on his hands to enact vengeance for some of David's old grudges and gripes, especially in regards to Joab, because the things that Joab does happened years ago, and David, as a king, did nothing. So I find this to be pretty cowardly on the aspect of David. And in a larger point of view, I think that most of what David does as king is actually pretty terrible, and that most of what we love about David happens before he became king. So, hey, there you go. Okay. Another question was, so David ended up living or reigning as king for 40 years. And somebody asked, is 40 years a long time or a short time to make for a king to rule? And so I went through, and the Bible gives a list of all the kings who succeed, and then for those kings, it usually gives a period of time in which they reigned. And 40 years is on the long end for any king. So if you were to look at the total for all of the kings of the northern kingdom, because after Solomon, the kingdom splits into kind of a little bit of a civil war sort of deal. Then there's two sets of kings. But if you look at the northern kingdom, they had 19 kings, and for the time listed in the Bible, it's 13.3 years per king. The longest reigning king in the northern kingdom is 28 years, and that was Jehu, the 10th king. So then if you look at the southern kingdom, the average for them was 20.1 years. The southern kings were generally more favorable or faithful. You see that Joash reigns for 40 years, Asa reigns for 41 years, and the guy with the most is Manasseh at 55 and Uzziah at 52. So David reigning 40 years is a long time. He probably was the oldest king at the time of his death, or close to it. We're not given dates of birth for all of the kings, but we know that David was 30 when he became king, and then he reigned another 40 years. So even for some of the kings who reigned the longest, they might have died older than David, but they could have also taken the throne at a much younger age. So there you go. I think that reigning 40 years is a long time as compared to a lot of the other kings, some of them only reigning in not a measure of years, but in days. Okay, here is, I think, even maybe an excellent question. What's a good legacy for us as followers of Jesus? So we're asking questions about David and his death, comparing it to Jesus, and then we're also bringing in this idea of, like, what's our legacy? What does it mean for us to have a good legacy? And I think here are a couple things that come to mind. One, if you have children, to pass your faith along to your kids so that they believe in Jesus. That is perhaps, I think, the greatest legacy that any of us can have, is passing the faith along to our kids. Now, for some of us, it's not God's plan nor intention that we should have kids. And so if you don't have kids, does that mean suddenly you can't have the greatest? No, I think your legacy then looks like something like passing along the faith to people in your life, supporting the faith of people in the church and in your community. So whether it's to your kids or to your neighbors or to a cousin or a nephew or whoever, making sure that the faith gets passed along to the next generation, I think, is absolutely key and paramount to anything talking about the legacy of a Christian. And then I think aside from that, living a life that exemplifies what Jesus has done for us. And I don't think that means a life that is free from sin, because none of us can live a life free from sin. But rather, as we are living this life, that we allow Jesus to change and transform us, and then we bring his love to others. And then I think there are probably other things that seem like, oh, well, look at Billy Graham and the legacy he had. I think there's people who are called to different things and they use their gifts well. But for you, as you're sitting there and you're like, I'm not Billy Graham, what legacy do I have? Listen, I think it's all about just taking the faith and passing it along to others. Okay, and so here's the last question from that week. Okay, so David was full of the Spirit, but was it the same as what we read about in the book of Acts? So I was trying to understand what this question meant, but we see that David has the Spirit come upon him. And I talked to the person who originally asked this question, and I asked them, what exactly are you trying to get at? And they're trying to understand, so what's the deal with the people having the Spirit in Acts? How similar is that to what's going on here when we see it in the Old Testament or with David? And as we look at what happens in Acts, we see something that is similar but very different from what's happening in the Old Testament. So as you read in the Old Testament, you see God's Spirit come upon certain people. And usually that is in relationship to them even giving some kind of prophetic word in which they are speaking to what God is doing, or it's in relationship to them doing some kind of miraculous act. And so that's another kind of thing. You see the Spirit of God comes on Samson, and he's able to do these tremendous feats of strength. But what happens in Acts 2, when the Spirit comes on the people at Pentecost, is that God is doing something different. More than just coming on the people to do miraculous things, which they do, God is dwelling in them instead of in the temple. So previously, God's Spirit dwelled at the temple, and what happens in Acts is that God's Spirit now dwells inside believers, inside of you. And so the incredible thing is that, yes, David had God's Spirit, but not in the same way that you have. You have God's Spirit in an entirely incredible and mystical and magnificent way, because God chooses you to dwell in. And that, my friends, is maybe one of the most amazing things about Christianity, about what we believe, is that God now dwells in us. So, hey, thanks for joining me for these questions. I don't know if this was better or worse than what I normally do, but it was fun to try something different. And so if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out, ask me. Love to respond to whatever you got. And if you think I said something that was wrong, feel free. Iron sharpens iron. So I don't think I have all the answers. Just trying to, one beggar telling another beggar where they found some bread. All right, thanks.